regime that one might adopt for a better security posture in their organization. Okay, so there recent years you see that we experienced pandemic, and then there was a great surge in attacks, and there was a turning point in cybersecurity. There was all the, especially the government entities were and infrastructure were targets of increased ransomware attacks and breaches and leakages, so there was a lot more changes due to that, and that there was a sense of urgency in the cybersecurity arena to create a strong culture of cyber hygiene. So, looking at 2023 so far, the breaches lately have been somewhat down. In the month of May, there was about 98 data breaches, breach records. In May 2023 was about about 98 million or so. Total number of data breaches in 2023 was 528, and number of records breached were about 45 million or so, which is lower than before, but it's still pretty significant. Some of the biggest breaches were 220 million records. So this problem is still around. It hasn't gone away. All it takes is one vulnerability or some sort of a misconfiguration to exploit your environment. So you want to be mindful of those things. So for our colleges and community college organization, it's important to understand what we need to protect. So we usually, our focus is on for the colleges is on PII. And sensitive information, financial aid records, student records, those are type of things are pretty significant. And, in terms of cybersecurity and protection of data, we need to have proper controls around them. So examples of PII for the folks who don't know, there's name, gender, social security number, sexual orientation, and driver license. As I mentioned, an organization must practice good cyber hygiene. A set of organization, can take some steps to do those, and measure certain basic measure to just similar to what you would do to have a hygiene for yourself. Like if you don't brush your teeth or floss your teeth, you're likely to have some cavity or some tooth decay or some other type of dental problems if you don't have a good hygiene. So preventative measure and issues that are important to be need to be applied. So the concept of cyber hygiene was traced back to Vint Cerf, who was the early architect of this idea, who came up with the idea that, as I mentioned, brushing your teeth, and then you would have the similar concept, that you apply to yourself, to your network and your environment. You will, you will understand why this is important. Conceptualizing cyber hygiene. So, as I mentioned, there's a microorganism, pathogens can lead to disease and cannot be viewed to naked eye. Similarly, there's a lot of exploits or social engineered cyber attacks. Until it's too late, they already done the damage. So as similar to we cannot accept, germs to make us sick, and we are willing to take precautionary measure to, correct those risks and safeguard against stuff, against those by washing hands, taking showers. We do need to apply this to our digital organization where you are implementing sound practices, procedures, standards, and tools that would enable us to have a better cyber hygiene to minimize leakage and breaches. If you want to further conceptualize, you need to have, better, overall practices and standards, and this is very important. So in terms of if you relate, cyber health and cybersecurity, if you look at poor heredity, which can basically mean software or configuration, which may include or use unreliable or obsolete components. Poor habits can be like, indiscriminate use of unreliable websites, software products, components, and technologies that can lead to infection or create a hole in security of your environment. Infection, is similar to like vulnerability that vulnerability may not cause compromise initially, but eventually it will result in some sort of exploit. Unbalanced nutrition, which means poor ingestion in terms of security, poor ingestion of business processes and technology processes, and lack of vaccination, for example, protection against specific vulnerability. If you're not vaccinated, you're vulnerable to certain viruses. Similar computers have viruses and vulnerabilities. Those need to have certain countermeasures in place to protect against them. Other things are, stressful work condition. Organization staff is so busy with routine operation, they sacrifice safety related activities, and chronic and acute pathology. Similar to that is in terms of security incidents can be long and discomforting and fast and severe. So just going into a brief overview of how data compromises happen are mostly through password theft, phishing, farming, and ransomware. So they each have some sort of a, impact on an organization, and those are the way, bad actors get into your environment. We can take a look at what password theft is. Password theft is common ways the common ways passwords are breached through GPO-based cracking tools and social engineering, including phishing. So how do you protect against that is through length and complexity of your password. If the longer the password, more complex it is, it's harder for the threat actors to exploit that. For example, Sony's CEO used a password of Sony ML3 and were stored, and password internal account was stored under a file called password. So the hackers very easily got that, and were able to crack this password quite easily. As I mentioned, passwords are not saved in plain text. They're encrypted and hashed. Algorithms such as ABCD123 would be MD hash, for that would be a very long hash. Password tests can be hashes are obtained through exploiting known vulnerabilities on a system, such as SQL injection, extracting the user databases containing password hashes, systems that have LLM on R, and enabled and comprised through such as responders, and these are the utilities they use to poison services to gather information in your network to exploit it. Once the passwords hash is obtained, as I mentioned, the cracking tools is used to check with a pre-compiled list of password against available hashes of an account. So they have data dictionary. These are pre-compiled list of words, phrases, and common unique strings to attempt to match passwords. And root fest attack is another way of attempting to try every possible combination of a given character or set, or usually to up to a certain level. A rule attack generates permutation against given word lists by modifying, trimming, extending, expanding, combining, and skipping words. There's password cracking tools. Ordinary computers can test over hundreds of millions of passwords per second using cracking tools running on general CPU. Billions per second GPU-based cracking tools. If you have a CPU, 2 to 7 cores can be done, and they're pretty reasonably efficient to crack your password. You will have the idea of how that works. In terms of scariness, so the lower the password combination, the simpler it is easier for the cracking tools and the bad actors to extract your password. As you can see, if it's small, it would take them 1 second. If it look for a password length of 7, it would take about 4 seconds. You have to be in the green section, around green, about 16 characters, or it will take them 691 years to crack that. So you want to be as complex as possible to prevent through against cracking tools. Password hygiene, what are the things you can do? Store your password on LastPass. So those are password managers. There are different type of password managers. Use whatever is available. Have your organization implement two-factor authentication, such as Duo or whatever is available. Do not share credentials with anybody. Have a cycle where passwords are required to be reset. Enable, disable, certain LLMR, NetBIOS, and local computer setting groups if they are not needed within the organization. Phishing, as you guys know, is a common way of social engineering attack to acquire personal information through manufactured email, look like a legitimate email. And it looks like it's coming from a trusted party, such as a bank, credit card, or HR, intended to trick you guys into clicking and downloading malicious files to infect your systems. Common attackers usually use slightly modified domain names. They will change, like they'll call Bank of America, or they misspell a certain letter in Bank of America, or add something towards the end to confuse the user. Another trick is edit the content of HTML tag to make it look like it goes to a legitimate website when it goes to actual, malicious website. So, those are the things phishing does. Farming goes hand in hand with phishing. It also redirects website to traffic to a fake website where looks identical or very similar to the website the user intend to go, and you would think you're using your actual internal website or bank website, and they will just capture your username and password because there's some some word or some slight modification they did to make it look like, but everything else, the screen, the pages, they just copied the content of the website to make it look like you're on the page. Phishing examples, email appeared to come from another college, user opened an attachment and ran a diagnostic test, discovered a polymorphic virus embedded in the attachment while the virus was in quarantine. It was too late to stop the infection. And then college recently installed update endpoint protection, but only portion of the system. Hackers set up a fake URL address for a bank, made fraudulent transfer totaling about $1 million from financial account. Only some amounts could be recovered. What are the things you can do to make yourself aware of these things? Always keep in mind the email is directly related to your work, and it's you always make sure that something that needs your involvement, and be very suspicious of the email. Do not enter information on the website without HTTPS, which begins with HTTPS in the beginning, errors and a lock symbol. communication is encrypted. Information entered cannot be immediately viewed according to the world, a website consortium. 59% of the websites uses HTTPS protocol. 71 of the world top 100 website in the world use HTTPS. And also, you want to be very careful of emails that imply urgency regarding passwords and accounts, which says, "Oh, change your password immediately. Your mail is box is out of space. There are a problem with the credit card. We have a new migration. Do this to go to this place." So be wary of these emails. Usually, these are the type of methods they use to trick users. Outlook, currently there's a lot of people are concerned about cybersecurity risks, and they're, as you can see, the industry is very worried about it. Briefly going to ransomware, what is a ransomware? Ransomware is a malware that encrypts data on your computer or a system until a ransom is paid to the attackers. And a specific amount of payment is requested by the attacker to decrypt the files they have, encrypted, generating bitcoins, and then they provide the decryption keys to the victim. In many cases, victims do not receive decryption keys to decrypt their files after having even paid the ransom. Some outlook in the impact, various industries being impacted, certain percentages. You can take a look. What is the financial impact? On average, ransomware was about 327,000, down 20% from Q4 2022. So it's coming down significantly compared to the few years, but still it's estimated by 2031 a ransomware attack will occur every 2 seconds. As you can see, it being increasing over the years. There's some projection by 2024 be 42 billions, and after that will be doubled. Every few years is going to be double in global ransomware damage costs. So things to be important to understand: how do they target ransomware targets organization, either through email phishing or RDP. So where they attach malicious document or redirect user to a malicious website. Once installed, there's a manual propagation or automated propagation to make that phishing to compromise the system. There's some high-level workflow of how ransomware works. So if you're interested, basically malicious software is downloaded. So infection basically originates from a phishing email. Malware embedded on a compromised web page, is also known as waterholing or compromised supply chain. And the next is attack is armed, where depending on the BIOS, malware replaces the file system, master boot record or UEFI firmware is bypassed. More exploits are installed in the background, and then the infection spreads. Basically, malware begins scans of the internal network for other points of ingestion, ingress or steal credential, and creates more vectors for lateral movement across the network. And then after that, malware attacks are deployed with payloads across the network, and payload will destroy the files from network, leaving only encrypted copies, infected programs that perpetually reactivate payload. And once that attack is successful, files are infected, systems are encrypted with AES or other type of encryption, and the victims are asked for, to pay the ransom. So some attack vectors, as I mentioned before, they also use RDP, as attack vectors. There is a ransomware type, commonly observed ransomware variant in Q1 2023. If you go through the list, there's the Black Cat that shared about 12.6% of the market share, is about 2% up. There's the Black Casta, Royal, Hive, Lockbit, Phobos, and some are like old, some are new. Sorry. Okay, and so back. My apologies, I have to go back. I went too far. Yeah, so looking at some of the ransomware, types of ransomware types. So Diniquavi is one type of ransomware, where it was is created by Grand Graft ransomware, and it was retired a few years ago. But it's important to understand how it works. Phishing or email containing a link to zip file contains JavaScript. Initially, it involves Oracle WebLogic, and it does few things. It will run on 32 or 64-bit shell code, depending on detected system architecture, and it will elevate privileges using Windows ALPC. How do you know this is happening? Signs of compromise. The infected system will have a ransomware note appear on the desktop, open in a notepad, desktop wallpaper change, background, and then target files are, there's many different types, and you get this type of note saying, do this ransomware, pay this way, if you want to decrypt your data. What does the file look like? So the file will look like these. If you look at those, they will take you to a payment page with the instructions and how to pay, and you have a given amount of time to do those things, and then you go from there. Another is they also sell some of the people operate as ransomware as a service on the dark web. There's another example of another ransomware type, which basically looks at leaked or weak Windows AD credentials, open RDPs, phishing emails, so this is what it looks like. A ransomware attack vectors. It was pretty bad like a few years ago, but it's changing a little bit. Email phishing, as you can see, is still a little bit down than a few years ago, but still significant. RDP compromises are slightly up, and software vulnerabilities, are going up a little bit. And internal is, and there's some other unknown vectors. Doppler is another type of ransomware. It's a download, basically downloadable temporary file, primarily found on, on cryptocurrency website. There's you can see known paths for that. The ransomware node for that, encrypted files, and the payment page. So they basically operate in similar fashion, some variety of, some slight variance amongst themselves, but in general, they're very similar. Okay, so one of the things they use to compromise or do the ransomware attacks is RDP. Why is it popular? It's called Remote Desktop Protocol. This was developed by Microsoft in 1990s as part of a Windows NT platform. Enables user to access computer from another location. If left open to the internet. Hackers can gain direct access to the remote server. Attackers usually scan for open port 3389. How do attackers, get access? So that will run port scan using Shodan, looking for open ports, TCP port 3389, then brute force RDP. Leaked credentials can be purchased also through websites. The use of phishing to gain access inside an organization. Once the attacker can brute force internal RDP access through the compromised device, he will have access. The attacker will use tools such as Mimikatz to harvest AD credentials. With administrative account, the threat actors will create elevated privileges with domain. Once the network attack will attempt to map its topography. Managed service providers in your organization should be considered security practices and reputation of third-party managed services. Threat actors often target MSPs with the objective of accessing clients' network to propagate the ransomware. Attack may also create spoof emails, use a compromised account belonging to MSP in order to phish the client. What are the best practices RDP security for ransomware? You may ask. Enforce strong AD password and administration policy. This will make cracking obtained hashes of password difficult. It will prevent indirect access to campus resources should an attacker gain access to the network. Domain admin accounts should be restricted and should not be used to administer low-level systems. Password theft. Once the hashes are obtained, a password correcting tool is used. As I mentioned, these things. Windows group policy, so can be used to create policy across the network. You want to enforce certain password length, complexities, and account lockout policies that you can push out through group policies to minimize people taking advantage of these things. So restrict RDP access through campus network only. So you want to have access to campus services through Windows machines should be only done with campus network. Outside access should only be allowed through VPN connection to your network, ensuring, and also monitor RDP. Two-factor, this should be used. What are two factors available? Highly recommended to use to minimize, ransomware attack. Only private Windows RDP access to user required. All the Windows can log in by default, but this should be changed. Remember, expert domain accounts should be limited to those only who directly required. And if remote SO is necessary for administration, you should remove all the admin level access through RDP and restrict the user to user account only. If the system requires RDP, please allow connection via VPN or 2FA, as mentioned correctly. Enable network level authentication end user. So what this does is requires end user to authenticate themselves before establishing a session with server hosting RDP services. This should be enabled. Prevent phishing. Training, user awareness training, train as much as possible, educate your user. Always keep in mind the email is it directly relate to me or required for my some sort of involvement. Be suspicious of email which has sense of urgency in them. Change password immediately. Your mailbox is full. There's a problem, or credit card. Those type of thing. Emails, you should be very mindful what they're trying to do. Cyber hygiene tips for preventing ransomware attack, as I mentioned. Preventing phishing, disabling macros. A strong password policy. Consistently monitor traffic, monitor new Windows events, security events, back off your systems, patch your systems as soon as the vulnerability is out. Implement RDP security best practices. Those are things you can take to have some sort of a cyber hygiene towards ransomware attacks. Be careful when you visit the sites. Make sure there's a lock, there's a HTTPS, sometimes they misspell the website to redirect you to a malicious website. Be very, very careful. Like here, you can see Amazon is with 2 N's. It's a small, and it looks like Amazon, but it's not really Amazon. Disable Microsoft Office macros, command that can automate tasks related to Microsoft. These can be abused to perform exploit on the system. Unless your organization requires, macros can be done. Without it, recommend, Office admin to disable, this org-wide. Similarly enforce password policy and 2FA for login. A strong password policy will make cracking of obtained password very difficult. This will make access to Windows AD more and more difficult for attackers. Back up your data often, and there's especially for critical asset, test them. Keep a backup in the cloud. On-premise backups can be infected during attacks. And consistently monitor your network traffic, discover unusual traffic on your network, and net flows and packet analysis if you can perform those. Windows event tools, use those to monitor your environment. Regularly patch your software and system as the vulnerability comes out. Run vulnerability scan through Nessus that we offer. This is a good way of finding vulnerabilities and patching them as needed. Develop a network diagram if you know where the systems are, and you can do better incident response. Restrict PowerShell usage as a tool for automating tasks, activity administration. So you want to minimize those. Should be only available for system admins. Enable transcription module and script block, logging. Network segmentation. So you want to physically and logically separate network, that can help separate various business or IT resources within the organization. This can help contain the impact of intrusion affecting your organization and limit lateral movement on the parts of malicious actors. So, you want to do that as possible. Analyze activity, behavioral patterns, and determine how to distinguish between malicious and legitimate user. You need to have a process in place, and you also want to secure your domain controllers by patching them. Have the latest version of Windows Server on the domain controller. Ensure the unnecessary software are not installed, and they can be, vulnerable and can be used for arbitrary code execution. Recommend DC group policy. Purpose protocols is recommended for authentication. Is not used to enable internal auditing to ensure only internal responses are sent across the network. What do you do if your system's infected? Although it's it's usual to shut down an infected system, the best action is to turn on and isolate the system from the network. This is to dump RAM memory analysis. There could be a chance of reaching cryptographic keys in the RAM. It's also to collect, and protect evidence and ransomware encryption keys. All right. So there's a lot of things. So I'm going to dive into another concept now. It's called the, zero trust. You may have heard it. There's a common vendor term used by lots of vendor, but it's really it's a zero trust is basically a framework, requiring all the users, whether in or outside the organization, of the organization network, to be authenticated, authorized, and continuously validated for security configuration and posture before granting or keeping access to the application of application and data. So the zero trust assumes that there is no traditional network edge, and networks can be local in the cloud, or a combination of or a combination or a hybrid with resources anywhere, as well as workers on any location. So the zero trust is a framework for securing, infrastructure and data for, modern digital transformation. It uniquely addresses the modern challenges today's business and offer, include, securing remote workers, as I mentioned, hybrid cloud environment, ransomware threats. And while you may have heard many vendors try to have their own definition of the zero trust, there are a number of standards that from or recognized organization that can help you align zero trust in your organization, if you are interested on those. Basically you focus on the business application and technical architecture of your organization to mitigate the risk more effectively, while managing complex deployment with a mind so basically it uses multiple components, as you can see in this diagram. Those core components are identity, application, enforcement, enrichment. So identity has user identity, device identity, user analytics, application. You catalog your what systems you're using, and then you enforce policy, segmentation, encryption, and then you do some sort of a threat intelligence, network analysis, and those type of things. So identifying user and devices when a user requests access. The risk must be evaluated to determine that if the organization can grant them, right? While what level of certainty that entity requesting is who they are asserting themselves to be. So how the sensitive data is going to be in the application, and does the device users connecting meet minimum security standards and is under the policy. Legacy architectures typically grant access based on one-time basis, though possibly duration limitation, and but in zero trust, it strives to extend access based on continuous risk evaluation, right? So you want to be mindful of that. Perhaps the most important function that zero trust offer, ensuring proper level of authentication of the users. Different level of requests requires different level of privileges. So you must enter, consider a number of times identification must be provided, and imagine yourself as a researcher. For a company, for a top secret project, you must enter the parking lot of the campus, move through the campus, and finally end the research lab. So there's a lot of things that may involve access to a gated area, vehicle identification, badge usage, metal detector, electronically verified badges, access to the lab, biometric scans, finger scan, biometric verification, those type of things may, happen. Similarly, devices, are information is that is known about used for access, right? So you need to manage device risk. What is known about the device that the user is requesting access from? Is it a managed device? Has it been observed accessing the application before? Is the current user typically for the device? Is the device a jailbreak, or does it have some basic cyber hygiene? So you want to make sure that the devices you have are clean. And then some people have find endpoints, EDR, and tools were being used to continuously monitor this cyber hygiene and to make sure that it has some vulnerabilities and risks are addressed properly. Those are the things you want to be careful of. In user analytics, as you can see, the device risk here versus control risk. If you have unmanaged devices, you will have lots of risk. And you have more secure managed devices, you will have better security in place, and you can secure your apps and data accordingly, and you have some monitoring in place to do those. So there's a lot of things you can do. You can catalog your your devices, and you want to be able to monitor them properly. So this is like if you look at your building where you operate, not every device in your organization is going to be user device. Some are going to be non-user device, such as solar panels, cooler towers, CCTVs, fire alarms. They all also operate on some sort of requires authentication and patching. So you want to be able to have a sound security in place to make sure that you minimize security risks around those. Insider threat, it's the most important thing in my opinion. Many users utilize managed network to conduct legitimate activities. At the time the network is used as a threat vector, just like highway as an enforcement agency looking to combat unlawful activity, you must have a way to detect legitimate activity on a managed network, right? So there is a difference between a hostile actor or the network on the network and and a legitimate actor. So you want to be able to identify and remove hostile actors from your organization and your network as needed. So you want to be able to perform that those things. So this is some recommendations on how zero trust work. It doesn't just a high level presentation of that. How you can manage technical risk, define how the strategies are, develop identity management and governance. Have a service catalog, have device management, identity management, and push role-based security, and security application data and databases in an efficient way that prevents from being data leak or ransomware attack. I think I'm out of time at this point. If anybody has any question, please post them in Q&A. I will answer them shortly. I think we are on sharing, and I think we're going to take a break. Is that correct? If we can get the,